Thank you for joining this part of our program. This is the first of what will be three conversations total with our recipients of Chicory Wealth's 1% for Social Justice contribution. This year's theme was broadly media and narrative. You may recall 1% for Social Justice is Chicory Wealth's contribution of 1% of our revenues to typically three organizations that we feel are doing excellent work, particularly at the grassroots level, and particularly for folks who are closest to the pain. So our first nominee and choice this year was a wonderful organization called Just Vision that is led by a dear friend of mine whose name is Suhad Babaa, who is here today. Good morning, Suhad. And Suhad and I know each other from work together in another nonprofit called the Women Donors Network. We were on the board together, and Suhad succeeded me actually as the board chair, God love her, WDN. So it's a pleasure to have you here today, Suhad. And please, would you introduce Alex also and tell us her role in your organization?
Absolutely. First and foremost, let me just say, Maggie, thank you. It's always an honor being in your presence, following in your footsteps, and being flanked and supported by you. So let me just start there and say that Alex is another human being that I have great reverence for. She is Just Vision's chief of staff. She joined our team about 2 years ago, and at the time I asked her to partner with me in transforming our organization for the next chapter and horizon of work ahead. And she's just been an anchor and cornerstone in what we've been building. And so I'm delighted that she's able to join me today as well.
Well, we're delighted to have her also. Thank you. So, Suhad, I just want to start. We talked about what we might want to talk about. And what I want to talk about is just to get a sense for our audience today of the history of Just Vision, its mission, where you've been, and then we can talk about the current situation and where you think you're going. So,
Of
go
course.
ahead.
Before I dive into that, let me just say really quickly for everyone who's joined us, just thank you. I know that Chicory's 1% program, and specifically for social justice, is a new endeavor, and how valuable it's been to have leaders and leadership like Chicory's in moving money to the field right now. And by that, I mean to our grassroots movements, to those justice movements of our times, is just so important, particularly as the world is being defined and reshaped in real time. So thank you for that. A little bit of background around Just Vision. We were founded about 21 years ago, actually in 2003. And at the time, my very dear friend and mentor and predecessor, Ronit Avni, um, decided to really look at this question of what was needed in Israel-Palestine and how might a team like her and several others at the time contribute to creating change. She was heavily focused on research, and it's actually a through line through our entire body of work. We're a heavily research-based organization. She didn't want to recreate the wheel, so she ended up interviewing 475 Palestinian and Israeli grassroots leaders who were rooted in the ground. So everywhere from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to Ramallah to Hebron to Masaferyata in the South Hebron Hills to Haifa and beyond. And they represented a wide range of industries and sectors. So you had some folks who were working on the front lines of nonviolent direct action for freedoms and rights. You had others who were working in the environmental sector, really looking at how might questions regarding sustainability be answered through various solutions in spite of an occupation that erodes at environmental sustainability. You still had others who are working through more traditional channels of human rights monitoring and documentation, or pounding at the pavement in our legal channels, our justice system, whatever that might look like, however flawed that might look like. Um, and she wanted to understand what were their greatest challenges, what were the opportunities that they saw. And unanimously across the board, they shared a sentiment that they felt invisible. And because of that, they felt ineffective, certainly within their own communities, across communities, and in the international world. And so Just Vision really emerges at that moment in time to provide a platform whereby stories about communities and communities who were trying to do things differently on the ground had a platform, had a megaphone, so to speak. In our earliest years, I mean, 2003 was before the rise of, the digital news, social media, right? And so, in its, what was kind of transformative at the time was producing interviews with someone who's speaking in Hebrew and making it available in Arabic and English. So people actually had access to these stories, right? Um, as we further developed, documentary soon became a key medium. It was both the disruptive medium at the time and what independent media makers really leaned into for a couple of reasons. I think it emerges as one of our core mediums back in the early 2000s. Documentary is immersive, right? It asks you for a moment to pause disbelief, to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to hear a story that you may not otherwise have access to. It transcends barriers, whether it's language or physical. You could literally take a film from place to place to place, or it be psychological, right? And so documentary becomes a core medium that we use in our storytelling in our early years to highlight Palestinian and Israeli grassroots leaders who are struggling for freedom and dignity and equality. Over the years, as the media landscape changes, and as we as a team really start desiring, wanting to not only use documentaries to disrupt master narratives, as we call them, and we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those master narratives are, we realized we really wanted to be able to weigh in on the 24-hour news cycle. And this was particularly true in Israeli society and Israel. And so we ended up launching a Hebrew language news site. This was about 11 years ago that takes us deeply, not only in the production of news, but also in the production of journalism and day-to-day investigative reporting. And so, today we are from, that over that 21 years, we now are a team of about 24 filmmakers, journalists, and human rights advocates. We span Gaza City, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem, Ramallah, New York City, Kentucky, Washington, D.C., and now Boston, most recently Boston. And we're an international team with a global footprint. And so, I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more about what that looks like, but maybe I'll stop there just in terms of where we started and where our roots are.
Right. So, I'm just going to ask a question that I'm just curious about. So there's this collaboration that happens early on in the organization between Palestinians and Israelis, right? And that continues to this day, correct?
So
And yeah,
yes, we're a mixed team.
yeah, you're a mixed, right, for lack of a better, I mean, right? Is that how we put, is that the phrase we use, right? It's a mixed team. So, so to me that like I'm very naive on these things, as you know, Suhad, but I mean, it seems like that's a big part of the story.
Yeah, it's interesting because for me, okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Palestinian and Korean, grew up as a queer woman of color in the 1990s, fighting the anti-war movement. And so, um, at the end of the day, I think these identities really, really matter. And the fact that, our team is a mixed team says something about our belief that ultimately we're all in this together, right? That's ultimately what that says, I think. The piece of it that I think has become really important to me as a leader and to our team is that look, great journalists and great filmmakers and folks who are shared and bound by values ought to transcend these identities, right? And so it's actually really, really important that we have at Just Vision have a shared sense of mission, have a shared sense of values, and commit to those values and work toward them together. And that's what ultimately we prioritize.
And is it fair to say part of that mission is to, really to the best of your ability, tell the truth of what the hell's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, today our work is really about truth telling. Ultimately, the best, when we think about what is the role of the New York Times and CNN and Fox News? God forbid I mentioned Fox News here. All of these outlets ultimately, if truly are committed to their role as the press and to protecting freedom of the press and journalistic integrity, should have squarely in their mission a dedication, commitment, and dogged loyalty to truth telling, right? And to holding those in power accounts, and where there isn't transparency, to shedding a light because it's the greatest disinfectant. Right. And so that's what we at Just Vision are committed to. I think, when we take a step back and we look at the Israeli-Palestinian context in our founding, we understood that the mainstream narratives around Israel-Palestine, largely perpetuated by mainstream media outfits, but also our political leaders and those in power, were really interested in kind of two key storylines. One was that kind of story about that reinforced narratives of violence. So does Israel-Palestine make it into the news? Well, when something is blowing up, quite literally, right? The second storyline that mainstream media has been really fascinated and infatuated with has been the failures of our diplomatic leaders and political leaders. And so you also have cameras zooming in when political leaders are going at it or when there's been scandal, right? What hasn't happened is actually holistic storytelling that takes a look at this issue from the ground up, literally taking a view from how do the policies and practices and the everyday realities impact real people, and what might that have, might those implications be? And so our work at Just Vision really says, well, if we move away from top-down storytelling, as we've seen it done so often, and approach this from the bottom up, what is the picture that we get? And we think we get two very important stories and angles that are missing from dominant media. That's one, you get context because you literally can see the communities, the people, the realities that people are living with, and that's essential context to understand what people are contending with. The second is you might also see glimmers of inspiration where political leaders fail. People actually lead. And so that's the lens that we take. And that's really kind of at the end of the day what we're trying to navigate and continue to navigate.
Mhm, mhm. So, I'm familiar with, is that what you mean, what you just described in terms of what you're trying to pierce? Is that what you mean when you say master narrative? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that is in broad brushstrokes. But let's like take the conceptual and do some granular work here.
Yeah, yeah.
So a good example of a recent, I'll give a couple of examples. So back in the early 2000s, one of the master narratives or dominant narratives that was kind of amplified and very prominent on Israel-Palestine was this idea that there was no partner for peace and there was no where was the Palestinian Gandhi? And you heard that trope over and over and over again. And we knew as a team, because we're rooted on the ground, that there had been, in fact, really incredible unarmed popular movements led by Palestinians with wide Israeli and international support that have actually gone missing. So, one example of this is the story of Budrus. Budrus is a Palestinian village in the West Bank. And in 2003 to 2004, when the community heard that Israel was building a separation wall, which would have ruined the community, it would have cut through the cemetery just past the girls' school and confiscated all of the agricultural land of the village, which is the prominent livelihood of the village. They decided to go on a nonviolent campaign. It ended up being 10 months long. And it drew the attention of Israeli activists and allies. Internationals flew in to help to support. They actually won. The Israeli government actually was forced to change the route of the separation wall. That story was not told. Um, the way, in the few instances where it was captured in the news or documented, it was being documented as riots and clashes, and the residents breaking the law and order.
Mm.
So it was neither told nor was it actually recognized as a win. It's not so far off from how stories of protests, in the racial justice uprisings here in the United States, let's say out of Baltimore, were covered, where you hear nothing about it in the media until a store gets set on fire.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that you had communities who were marching out in the streets, having peaceful protests, barbecuing to like have their voices raised in community for weeks and weeks and weeks, right? And so Budrus is our 2009 documentary, which aims to actually put that nonviolent resistance on the map and challenge the dominant narrative that there are no Palestinian Gandhis, or more simply put, all Palestinians are terrorists, right?
Right.
That's the master narrative in that
Right.
instance. Now, another more recent example, and Maggie, you're close to this, right? Because one, this is a story where I had the chance to share it in Atlanta uh,
Yes.
several years ago, and then you invited us back to screen for the community at Chicory and your faith community, and that was such an amazing experience. But Boycott is our last documentary film, our most recent documentary film that was released in 2021. I'm losing track of time.
Don't we all, Suhad?
2021. And, with that story, really, back in 2014, 15, we started following the stories of anti-boycott laws that we started hearing murmurings of being introduced at the state level here in the United States. Okay, so pause. What are the anti-boycott laws? For those of you who may be unfamiliar, the anti-boycott laws are state level legislation that requires federal or public contractors to sign a pledge that they do not engage in boycotts of the state of Israel. Um, those laws have kind of metastasized. So you have the likes of ALEC, combined with various lobbying organizations like Christians United for Israel, et cetera, that have used those laws as a template to prohibit also public contractors from engaging in boycotts of fossil fuels, or engaging in boycotts of the weapons industry, or engaging in boycotts of entities that will not provide abortion care, or the list goes on and on and on. And so back in 2014, when we started.
Can I just pause you? Because I really want this to sink in, because I think it's easy for people to not quite get the implications of this. So if you were a teacher in a certain state, as an individual, private citizen of the United States, you would be asked to sign a pledge that you personally would never participate in a boycott of X. I mean, it started with Israel, but to your point, it's expanded to these other areas very actively.
That's right. That's right.
I heard Donald Trump. Oh, I remember what it was. It was when things started to blow up around Tesla, and he started to refer to it as illegal boycotting.
Mhm.
Let me just think about that for a minute. How do you prove you're not boycotting? Do I have to go buy a fucking Tesla?
Well, Maggie, that's exactly the point. I mean, like the amount of even to implement these laws, the level of government interference that would be required to investigate is just insane. You're talking about a full-fledged fascist and authoritarian regime that would be prying into your day-to-day lives, right? To implement that. I think the other piece that is, that we have to hold in this is that is a complete reversal of one of the our most cherished historical periods, where the United States actually enshrines boycotts as one of the key pillars of First Amendment rights as a result of getting it wrong during the civil rights era, right? In 1982, the Supreme Court reverses lower court rulings that condemned boycotts in Mississippi as illegal, and says, actually, we got it wrong. Let's course correct, because boycotts, using your purchasing power to express your political voice, is actually and to do that at a collective level, both individually and as a collective, is actually an incredibly important part of our ability to protest and dissent with government.
Yeah, I mean, one could argue that it's even a business model. I don't know. I know some firms,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Right.
right? Where this is functionally what we're doing.
That's right. That's right. And the narrative around this starts in ways, that are deeply insidious, right? So, with these anti-boycott laws, the narrative that started to get pushed by attorney generals was that those who are engaging in boycotts of the state of Israel, right, who are advocating for Palestinian rights by using boycotts, are actually engaging in anti-Semitism,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? You see that then translated to the environment. So now it's those who are advocating for environmental rights are actually discriminating against big oil,
Right, right,
right?
because we need to protect big oil. They
Right.
have rights too, right?
Right. And one of the things that I think, gets lost is actually what's at stake here and what
Right.
is the reality. You're talking about, who are these laws being wielded against? It completely undermines the narrative, right? If you look at one of the plaintiffs around these anti-boycott laws, his name is Alan Leverett. He is a newsman out of Arkansas. He actually runs one of the only standing independent news outfits in the state, the Arkansas Times. Allen, the way he gets pulled into this, he didn't even know there was a boycott movement of Israel. He, back in 2016, 17, as many independent newspapers go, sells advertising space to local businesses, public-private partnerships, local universities, etc. And so he invoices the local university to get payment on an ad that they bought in his newspaper. And the guy who's supposed to be processing the payment says, "Hey, Alan, we can't actually pay you until you sign this oath." And it's literally an oath certifying that the Arkansas Times doesn't engage in boycotts of the state of Israel. Alan at the time is just appalled. He's like, whoa, not only are you, we don't report on Israel. We don't do anything. Our business has nothing to do with this issue area. I didn't even know there was a boycott. So he learned a lot through this process, actually.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, and then he says, but you're also forcing me to take a position. I'm a newsman. I shouldn't be forced to take any kind of position on anything, and I refuse to do that. And so purely from the perspective of First Amendment rights, he says, I absolutely will not sign this. His case gets taken by the ACLU, um, and they end up moving through the courts. Unfortunately, Allen's case, he ends up losing it in Arkansas, and he ends up at the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, ends up withholding upholding the Arkansas ruling. Now that's the exception. There are several other plaintiffs, right? People like Bahia Maui in Texas, who was a teacher who refused to sign the same oath. She got fired. Luckily, in Texas, she ends up winning her case. Same thing in Arizona. Mick Jordahl, a lawyer who he provides counsel to uh, incarcerated folks in local prisons in Arizona. He similarly gets his contract pulled when he refuses to sign it. He also ends up winning. So what we're seeing now is a big disconnect where courts, with the exception of Allen's case, court after court after court is saying this is unconstitutional. Boycotts are protected, and yet you have 38 states that have these laws on the books. You also now have the federal government, now that there's a GOP-controlled Congress, introducing these bills at the federal level. Importantly, and this is quite scary, they're introducing it with a 20-year criminal sentence.
Mhm.
And so this is, really once you let Pandora's box open, there's
Mhm.
a big question about, who's next. And what we know is that we're all on the chopping block. So we got to fight this together.
Right. We're all on the menu, as I like to say. Yeah. Um, has any of this, I remember the film, there was some implication that this was going to go to the Supreme Court. Did it go that far? What happened?
The ACLU ended up petitioning the Supreme Court to take Allen's case. The Supreme Court ended up not taking it. So, like most, I will say the context here is that the Supreme Court takes less than 1% of cases that are brought before it.
Yeah.
So it was really unsurprising that they didn't take it. Um, and so this continues to play out in the courts. Importantly, I think, what it also is playing out at the local level. There's several repeal efforts taking place in states like Illinois, in places like Minnesota. And there's several local campaigns to beat back the bill where it hasn't yet gained traction. So places like Virginia, Massachusetts, where it comes back year after year.
Hmm. 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 Amazing. Reversal of the way things, yeah. Um, so, obviously things are um, very, very uh, uh, difficult for your people now, I would think, who are on the ground um, in all over that region. What's going on? I mean, give us a little bit of what's happening on the ground.
Thanks, Maggie, for the question. So our team, thankfully, everyone is physically okay. We have, as I mentioned, we do have team members in Gaza, in Israel, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so, as you might imagine, everyone's been on high alert now for the last 20 months. The last 20 months has really hit everyone very close to home. And what that has meant for us is, I think, twofold. One, given our mission to really fill the media gap and tell the stories that are missing, our number one focus has been to tell the stories that no one's hearing or wouldn't have access to otherwise. We are one of the only independent media teams, frankly, one of the only teams left in Gaza. So our team has been reporting consistently in Gaza. As you might know, Maggie, Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been targeted and killed at a rate that's been unprecedented. The Committee to Protect Journalists has actually noted that in the entirety of their existence, they have not seen a rate of killing of journalists in any other conflict zone in the world. And so our journalists are incredible, fearless, and doing what they need to do to survive and get the story out. In Israel, our team is one of the few courageous bastions for truth telling in an environment where the government is increasingly repressive and cracking down on any forms of dissent. And we have a team of journalists at Local Call, which is our Hebrew language news site that I mentioned earlier. Um, Today, we have a reach of about 800,000 readers annually, which is quite meaningful when you look at the context and the size of Israeli society. It's about 8.8 million. So it's a significant kind of reach. At the same time, the perspective that Local Call puts out in the world is not popular. Since October 7th, and the kind of ensuing genocide over the last 20 months, there has been a deep kind of mob mentality, particularly with right-wing kind of interests driving mob behaviors that are going unchecked by the government that frankly aligns with a lot of those right-wing interests. And we've had our journalists have to go into hiding. One of our journalists actually simply for expressing sympathy with the people in Gaza who were being killed in the early days after the genocide began in November of 2023, actually had a right-wing mob storm his home. They located his home, banged on the walls, shot firecrackers and guns into the air. And after that, he's gone into an unnamed location where he continues to do his reporting. And so, our team is navigating this and also deeply committed to getting the story out. And this is the reality, I think, for journalists and storytellers who are committed to truth telling increasingly around the world. But it's especially acute right now for us and in sharp focus. The other pieces I think that, really came to light over the last 20 months. I think a lot of the work that we did to diversify the storytelling that we did, from documentary to being able to produce, day-to-day journalism, coupled with building out a network with journalists and editors at all of your top main media outlets, it really positioned us in the last 20 months to be a go-to resource and to tell stories that no one else really had access to. So a good example, we've been producing an investigative series that has been looking at the role of AI and technology in Gaza, and specifically the AI and technology that the Israeli government and military has been using to execute its genocide in Gaza. So that has taken us to, from revealing kind of Israeli policy that has shifted kind of norms from allowing several dozen Palestinians as collateral damage to several hundreds of Palestinians as collateral damage. That was an actual intentional policy shift in the last 20 months. They then coupled that policy shift with unleashing AI technologies that they've been developing over the course of the last many years to test and to see what they can really do. And everything from tools called the gospel, which sadly is being used to target buildings and create psychological damage of Palestinians. If you could destroy the mosques, destroy the universities, destroy their actual social fabric, it will put pressure on them over time, is the theory, to tools like the AI tool Where is Daddy, that literally is tracking to see when a supposed target or alleged target enters their home so that they could bomb the entire family and destroy it from the ground up, to tools like Lavender, which do similar things. We also learned in those investigations, that the Israeli army has built deep partnerships with teams like Microsoft,
Mhm.
and they're unleashing tools equivalent to OpenAI's ChatGPT, et cetera, working hand in hand with personnel who are literally building, this next century's weaponry to be used in warfare. So that's, some of the work that we've been focusing on. And that's really kind of the fire in our belly, is knowing that, our team has no choice. They are living this. And there's going to be a deep commitment to getting this story out so that the world knows and has, we ultimately have as a community, as a society, a choice to do something with that information. Absorb it and do something with it, or absorb it and pretend it's not there. And we hope that it's the former and not the latter.
It sounds like a learning lab for how to
More
kill
about
people.
that.
Well, I'm just thinking about what you're describing. I mean, if these are, relatively new, and they are, I think, relatively new tools. It's like we've got a bunch of innocent guinea pigs, so we're going to test this out. I mean, it's like what comes to mind for me is the way new weaponry was unleashed during World War One.
Yeah.
That that no one quite got fully what the implications were. Well, I mean, certainly some people did, but I mean, the broader population didn't quite get, and then of course, it continued to advance.
Yeah.
The other thing that's coming to mind for me, Suhad, and I hope this isn't a non sequitur, but I'm struck. When in moments in the past when I have been depressed at a situation, not like personally depressed, but like actually like existentially depressed. I have gone back to look at I've found some like historical moment to go and do a deep dive in. So some of you heard me say this during the 2008, 2009 crisis. For whatever reason, I just laid in bed at night and read World War One novels. I don't know why. It just seemed somehow to frame something for me. And of late, I have been watching. There's a new series on Netflix called Turning Point, and it's reviewing certain historical moments, and one of which, of course, is Vietnam, which you would think had been done to death in a sense, but no, actually, there's more. And one of the things I was struck by, and of course, I lived this as a child or a young person, was the graphicness of the broader news outlets, of which there were only three, really, and how much the reporters were in combat, in the field, reporting on the actual destruction, including the destruction being perpetrated by US soldiers on
Yeah.
villages, etc. And Morley Safer, and the Dan Rathers and the Walter Cronkites, famously Johnson's like, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, basically I'm screwed. And he decides not to run again, doesn't. But they're showing some of that footage in this, and I recall it. as a kid. I hadn't seen it in a long time. And then I was remembering how much that got shut down during the Iraqi war.
Yeah,
The whole thing looked like a video game.
that's right.
And so this way in which the political powers have made sure there's, nowhere near the level. Of course, we don't even have three major news outlets anymore. So, I mean, we have this splintering. So, I don't know. I'm just struck by the fact that, trying to get at the root of a story and how hard it is to get that out and how much the major outlets simply don't do it. I mean, they just don't,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah, so there's a couple of things I think on that, which is, yeah, I think that given the media ecosystem today, it's increasingly hard to have stories like the ones that we tell make it out into the world, and be told with fairness and accuracy on these mainstream media outlets. What I will say a couple of things, which is, early on over the last 20 months, I was talking with a dear friend who looked at me, and she was very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movements, and is an anti-war activist and organizer. And she says, Sahad, this is Palestine's Vietnam moment. What did she mean by that? Um, you know, Despite the kind of desire of many in political power and many in positions of power around the world to keep a lid on this thing, we are seeing a pouring out of people across the streets just about everywhere around the globe, and importantly in the United States. Why does that matter? In our view, Israel-Palestine matters because the people who are there are going to have to live with whatever ends up happening. They are the ones who are most deeply impacted and need to resolve this conflict, need to put an end to the occupation, end to genocide, end to apartheid, and figure it out, right? At the same time, the United States plays an outsized role. Not only do we provide um, diplomatic and financial cover, we're also providing diplomatic cover and arms. And so what the United States position on this is actually does play a big role. And in our theory of change, we believe that if movement happens on the ground and is heard internationally and the US gets out of the way, guess what? Things will start to move. Now, US public opinion over the last 20 years has dramatically shifted on this issue. Um, and it's the first time that we're seeing in the last 5 years in particular, those who identify with being Democrats have become more sympathetic for Palestinian rights than for the protection of the state of Israel. That's a dramatic, actually, shift. It used to be that the case that both Republicans and Democrats were in lockstep with overwhelming support for the state of Israel and its behaviors. Now, that actually is really important because it says that public opinion, public sentiment is shifting. Like abortion, most Americans care about women having the right to have abortions. Most Americans want firmer gun reform in place and laws in place. It hasn't yet caught up with the political establishment, but there's some immense gains that have happened on Israel-Palestine that we haven't historically seen. Now, the reason, in the absence of these mainstream media outlets telling the story, I think is because you are seeing teams, you are seeing individuals, you are seeing citizens who are telling these stories and doing it with consistency and accuracy across, like this is for better or for worse. And this is like, it sounds glib, but this is the first genocide we've seen live streamed
Yeah.
historically.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's going to do something ultimately. And it has, right? I think you've also seen, these investigations I've talked about, they've been cited by South Africa in the petition to the ICC and ICJ, right, as evidence. When we talk about mainstream media outlets, while they may not have journalists and correspondents on the ground, and in some cases for structural reasons, right? The Israeli government will not allow foreign correspondents in Gaza. They won't allow them. So, unlike Vietnam, you don't actually have people on the
Can't
ground.
get in.
The only
Mhm.
people you have are Palestinians right? So, which taught, which I think also it makes sense when you think about why might the Israeli government be targeting Palestinian journalists so heavily.
Of
They don't
course.
want this story broken. And so despite kind of mainstream media's kind of blind spots on this issue area, at some point, there has to be some level of engagement with the content that's coming out in the world. And that's Just Vision's model, is really to say, look, let's build a model where we're not only producing excellent world-class media that can contend with the best, let's also make sure that we have our own outreach and distribution and partnership teams that force people to pay attention, the right people to pay attention. And what we've seen, whether it's with our documentaries or our investigations, through strategic partnerships, strategic allyship, making sure that we're reaching the right audiences, we have been fortunate to have the attention of the CNNs of the world and the New York Times of the world. And so really for me, I think about this as, this is also for those of you who don't know me, I come to this work first as a community organizer. I learned how to be a news publisher and a filmmaker and a media maker really in the trenches. And as a community organizer, what I know is that there's always an inside-outside game, right? There's always going to be good people within these institutions who want to figure out the right thing to do.
Mm.
And it benefits. They're able to do more things when outside of those institutions, people are pushing. And so really
Yeah.
figuring out who are the journalists, who are the editors who get it, who know that these are the stories that need to be told, who are willing to create space, and really finding ways to thread that needle has become part of the model that we also hold, even as we refuse to be dependent on those institutions because we know that they may or may not want this work ultimately, right? They may or may not want to amplify it. So how do we make sure that our strategy doesn't rely on them being our channels of distribution?
Mhm. Mhm. So, do I detect some hope in your assessment, Sihat?
Ooh.
So please feel free to share it. Or if I'm wrong there, I mean, I heard you say something somewhere in the midst of that was like, there's something coming to the head and maybe there's a possibility for actual change. Is that your?
Yeah, so I am a deep practitioner of hope. Some
Yes.
days I practice it better than others.
No, don't worry.
Here's what I think on a really serious note. I think we are at a defining moment. I think we have the ingredients in place to do some transformative work on Palestinian rights, um, both in the United States, globally, and most importantly for the communities on the ground who are dealing with this and living this every day. Um, I don't think it's going to happen without a fight. I think this is the moment where we need to be making choices about how we show up, um, and who's going to be on the right side of history.
Mm.
Um, and it's a watershed moment. So how we show up today is going to define how this plays out, not just in the immediate. I do believe it will define how things play out over the next several decades, and for several generations. So that's where my hope lies, is that we have ingredients in place that are really um, that are meaningful and substantive that we can work with. Now, I think the other piece to this is also recognizing that, it's easy for me to say that. My team on the ground can't, you know, you talk to my colleagues in Gaza, they're talking about whether they have flour or they're grinding spaghetti to make a form of rice to try to feed their kids, right? Um, they don't have bags of flour. They don't have nutrition. Their teeth are falling out. They are starving, like quite literally. So, if we actually expect for change to happen on this issue area, we need to stop the bleeding, right? There is no mental space for people and communities on the ground who are living trauma daily over and over and over again to reckon with and contend with what's happening. So, I think the pressure right now in the immediate needs to be stop the genocide, get a ceasefire in place, make sure people are taken care of, and really think about the fact that once that happens, we have the ingredients in place to make transformative things happen on Israel-Palestine. The genocide is not a humanitarian crisis. It is a political problem. People make those choices of what
Yes.
happens.
Yes.
And at this moment in time, the only thing that's stopping us from creating change is a United States government that refuses to get out of the way and an Israeli government that refuses to be held accountable.
Mhm.
And that's where we need to start with this work.
Mhm. Mhm. Wow. Well,
So was that hopeful or glib?
it certainly wasn't glib. If that's your glib, I don't want to see your let's get real. Okay. Like, holy cow. So no, that isn't glib. I think it's realistic and I think it's possible. There are moments where it feels like things are really sliding hard, but things do that historically, and then there's a pushback, and it seems all of a piece to me. I mean, it's like all that's going on nationally and internationally seems all very deeply interconnected.
That's right.
Um, so
That's right.
we could tease that out. We could take another 3 hours, but we can't do that today. But a question, there was just a media question one of our clients asked because I was banging on the media. What's your take of how good the Guardian is on these things? Do you feel like the Guardian is a good
Yeah,
preventative?
The Guardian's been awesome to work with. So we actually have partnered with the Guardian on that investigative series that I mentioned. And they've been wonderful in terms of getting these stories out. They also have been wonderful in getting out a number of other stories that we've had no part in, right, on their own accord. So we've seen our colleagues at The Guardian just really, really be deeply committed to this issue area. And I think it's true also of their coverage of a number of issue areas that are burning. I think there was a period where, especially in this latest round of Trump's rise to power, you've seen many media outlets actually not want to go head to head with the Trump
Yeah,
administration, including the LA Times, which was the kind of probably the most visible display of bending the knee. And then you've had teams like The Guardian on the other end of the spectrum that said, absolutely not. We're going to make sure that we do our jobs as journalists. And so, in shorts, yes, they've been great.
yes. We like the Guardian, support the Guardian. Well, this has been a really amazing conversation. I appreciate you taking the time. I will remind all of you on the call, we have an event scheduled for Saturday evening, October 25th. Suhad will grace us with her presence, which I'm excited to see because as you already know, we're also friends. So it'll be great to have you come in and be able to meet some folks face to face. We certainly we hope our clients join us in supporting Just Vision as well as our other two recipients of the 1% for Social Justice, which you will be hearing more from later this year. So don't hesitate to make a contribution. And if you do, let us know because we like to keep count and we won't have an easy way to keep count the way we do it now. So if you do decide to support Just Vision, please let us know. Um, so we're pretty much at time. I just want to again thank you very much. And I'll just, if there anybody else who has any last questions they want to throw in the chat, you got 30 seconds or we'll say goodbye. It is a lovely day out if you're in Atlanta, so you may be just saying goodbye and that's okay. But again, thank you. Thanks for being with us, Alex. Thank you, Suhad. And for those of you who joined, thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Liv. Thank you, everybody.
Bye all.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
So meaningful to be with you.
Oh, it's so great to have you, Suhad. Thanks for coming.
I
Thanks
really,
for taking
really
the
appreciate
time. I always love our conversations. Thank you, Audrey. Thanks for joining. There's just so much going on, and there's a range of things, but to be in the front lines and to be witnessing what I know you are witnessing on a day-to-day basis. Honest to God, I don't know how you hold it together, but you do, and we're grateful you do.
Thank you, Maggie. Beth, it's so great to see you and Audrey. I don't think we've yet met, but thank you all for being with us. And if there's an interest amongst this group for more resources and information, Maggie will send you and Liv a bunch of good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just know that, part of our ability to keep it together and keep our head on is actually having a village around us that's championing us. So thank you for being part of that.
Oh, absolutely. You are very, very welcome. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. I hope to talk with you again soon, Suhad. All right. Take care. Thanks, Liv. Thanks, Alex. Bye-bye.